Among the Varexians, softness had always been read as fragility. That belief is exactly why an entire stadium fell into stunned silence the moment a single human refused to make the choice they demanded of him. Alarms rolled across the Capitol like slow rolling thunder trapped inside steel, while Ryan Mercer stood alone under the blinding lights of the Grand Judgment Coliseum. Freezing rain hammered against the energy barrier overhead, turning the enormous structure into a shimmering shell of fog and pale blue flame. More than 80,000 onlookers packed the rising tiers around him, their voices reduced to a dull electric murmur nearly drowned beneath the storm. Enormous floating banners drifted above the arena floor, repeating the same phrase in 6 different alien scripts. The rite of ascension begins. Ryan's boots dragged across the polished black stone as 2 armored guards pushed him toward the platform. The restraints around his wrists pulsed a dull orange, faintly warm on his skin, though he ignored them completely. His attention stayed fixed on the raised dais ahead, where 2 women stood beneath twin columns of light. Princess Valera stood rigid despite the glowing collar locked around her throat. Her cyan-toned skin caught the arena lights like wet glass, silver markings tracing both arms beneath ceremonial armor she wore as though nothing could touch her. Rain streaked through her pale hair as she stared straight ahead, refusing to break. Beside her stood her younger sister Nisara, smaller, gentler, carrying none of her sister's iron composure. Her skin held a soft violet-blue hue, and she looked cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Her hands shook beneath the oversized ceremonial robe draped across her shoulders, yet her golden eyes stayed steady. Not frightened, exactly, just heavy with sorrow. Something twisted in Ryan's chest when he noticed the elder sister leaning slightly to shield the younger one from the worst of the downpour, doing it without seeming to think at all. Even here, in the middle of a public execution disguised as ceremony, the Empire still expected them to perform composure. A deep horn shook the outer walls of the arena, and the crowd dropped into silence instantly. High above, Emperor Kaler Van stepped onto the imperial balcony carved from black volcanic stone. His long crimson robes trailed behind him like a living shadow, while hovering mechanical attendants kept his floating crown steady above his head. The old ruler surveyed the arena with the flat, distant calm of someone watching machinery rather than people. Citizen Ryan Mercer, representative of Earth, his voice thundered through the storm. You now stand before the sacred rite of ascension. Thousands of drifting recording spheres turned toward him at once. Ryan could feel, almost as a physical weight, an entire civilization watching him breathe. By imperial decree, the emperor continued, one princess will claim the throne, along with a worthy consort of her choosing. The other, he added, without any change in tone, will be permanently removed from the line of succession. Ryan's jaw tightened. Removed. They always dressed up something monstrous in gentler language. An attendant stepped forward carrying a tall silver staff crowned with 2 glowing stones, one blue, one gold. Humans claim to place morality above pure logic, Kaler said. Tonight we find out whether that claim holds any weight, or whether it's just a story your species repeats to itself. The crowd didn't stir. No one questioned what was happening. Not a single face showed discomfort. To them, this was simply governance, tradition, order dressed in the costume of virtue. Ryan raised his eyes back to the sisters. Valera met his gaze first. No anger in it, only bone-deep exhaustion. Nisara looked at him differently, as if she already understood this moment would hurt him too, in some smaller, quieter way. The emperor spread his arms wide across the arena. Choose your bride, human, he announced. The other will not survive the hour. The words struck harder than the storm itself. Lightning split the sky above the dome in jagged white lines. Strangely, Ryan's heartbeat slowed instead of racing, the way it always did in his worst moments, some leftover instinct from years of crisis. The battlefield. The burning evacuation zones on Orion 9. Refugee transports collapsing mid-flight. His mind always went quiet, exactly when everyone else's fell apart. He looked down at the staff being offered to him. Blue crystal for gold crystal for Nis. One life spared. One erased. Clean and efficient, and entirely without feeling. Ryan finally reached forward. The whole arena leaned in as one. Then he did something no one had prepared for. He pushed the staff aside. The attendant stumbled back, nearly dropping it. A wave of confused murmuring spread through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Ryan lifted his restrained hand and looked straight up at Emperor Kaler Van. "People aren't prizes," he said, quiet but perfectly clear. The arena went completely still. Even the storm seemed to hold its breath. For the first time in centuries, the Galactic Empire had no idea how to answer a single human being. The stunned quiet lasted only a few seconds before the shouting began. Noble officials shot up from their crystal seats in outrage, while military officers barked commands into glowing wrist units. Across the towering rows, thousands of alien faces stared down at Ryan, as if they had just watched gravity stop working. Rain kept beating against the shield above, sending silver ripples of light sliding across its surface. Ryan barely registered any of it. His focus stayed locked on the two sisters standing beneath the execution pillars. Princess Valera looked genuinely stunned, maybe for the first time since stepping into the arena. Her rigid discipline cracked slightly, revealing something far more human underneath. Confusion. Beside her, Nisara dropped her eyes to the ground, as though she couldn't bear to look at him anymore. Far above, Emperor Kalavan stood frozen, though the floating attendants circling his throne began drifting nervously. Ryan could feel the pressure building inside the arena, like a reactor approaching meltdown. "Citizen Mercer," the Emperor said, at last, his tone colder now. "You misunderstand your position." Ryan turned slowly to face the balcony. "No," he replied. "I understand it perfectly." More murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several guards tightened their grip on the pulse, rods slung across their shoulders. The Emperor descended with mechanical precision until his dark robes hovered only 20 feet above the arena floor. Rainlight traced the silver markings carved into his pale crimson skin. He looked less like a tyrant now, and more like something ancient, tired the way mountains grow tired after standing too long. "You are chosen because your species carries an emotional instinct rarely found in advanced civilizations," Kaler said. "This right demands moral judgment. Your refusal invalidates it." Ryan gave a tired nod. "Then maybe it deserves to be invalidated." A collective gasp moved through the crowd. One noblewoman near the front actually flinched, as though he'd shouted something obscene inside a temple. Ryan had seen that reaction before, usually from officers who hated hearing an inconvenient truth said out loud. The Emperor studied him carefully, almost clinically. "Do you understand why your kind unsettles us, human?" Ryan shrugged. "Because we ask too many annoying questions?" To his surprise, a handful of younger spectators nearly laughed before catching themselves. Kaler ignored it entirely. "Because humans destabilize systems," the Emperor said. "You place feeling above efficiency, compassion above order. You interfere with natural hierarchy wherever you find it." Ryan glanced toward the sisters. "And that hierarchy is what's holding your empire together?" For the first time, Kalar didn't answer right away. The silence stretched long enough for the sound of rain to return. Thunder rolled softly somewhere above the shielded sky. Then Valera stepped forward, despite the chains still tethered to her collar. "Enough," she said sharply, her voice carrying real authority even now. "The human has already dishonored the right. Finish the judgment and release my sister." Nisara shook her head immediately. "No," her voice barely rose above the storm, though the arena still caught it. "If anyone should remain, it should be her." Ryan closed his eyes briefly. Of course. Of course. Neither one wanted to be the one who survived. He'd seen soldiers behave exactly that way during the Orion evacuation, willing to disappear quietly so someone else could go home. The Emperor studied his daughters now not as a ruler evaluating subjects, but as a father, badly failing to hide that he was one. Ryan caught the shift instantly. Small things mattered enormously in moments like this. The faint tightening around Kaler's eyes, the pause before he breathed again, the way his hands went completely still behind his back. Humanity wasn't remarkable for feeling emotion. Every species did that in its own way. Humanity was remarkable for recognizing emotion even when someone was actively trying to bury it under centuries of ceremony. A warning siren cut through the arena. Red light flared along the outer walls as fully armored guards flooded into formation around the platform, their polished helmets catching fractured streaks of the storm above. One commander stepped forward and bowed toward the Emperor. "Your Majesty?" he reported. "Unrest is spreading beyond the district. Crowds are gathering at the palace gates." Kaler frowned. "For what purpose?" The commander hesitated a beat too long. They're demanding the right be suspended. Ryan blinked, honestly caught off guard. The Emperor turned slowly to face the crowd surrounding the arena. Thousands of faces stared back at him now, uncertain, uneasy, watching their ruler differently than before. Ryan felt the shift happen in real time. Small, fragile, but absolutely real. An empire built entirely on obedience had just been forced, without warning, to start thinking for itself. By midnight, the storm had turned the palace district into a shifting sea of silver fog and flashing blue emergency light. Ryan stood alone beside the narrow window of his holding chamber, watching rain crawl endlessly down the transparent alloy outside. Hundreds of feet below, crowds packed every street surrounding the citadel. The reinforced walls blocked their voices completely, but the movement below was unmistakable. Signs. Floating holograms, citizens who refused to leave despite the bitter cold. The Empire had spent centuries teaching obedience. Tonight, without meaning to, it had accidentally taught its people to question it. Behind him, the chamber door hissed as its lock disengaged. Ryan turned. Princess Valera stepped in first, the glowing collar still fastened at her throat. Two guards escorted her inside before sealing the door behind them without a word. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The room smelled faintly of recycled air and polished metal, though traces of rain still clung to her silver hair. Up close, the elder princess looked even more worn than she had in the arena. Not physically, emotionally hollowed out, like someone who had spent years quietly refusing to drown in front of an audience. "You humiliated the Emperor in front of his entire empire," she said finally. Ryan leaned back against the window. "Yeah, I noticed that myself." To his surprise, something close to real amusement flickered across her cyan eyes before vanishing again. She crossed the room with careful precision, the chain at her collar rattling faintly with every step. Ryan hated that sound instantly. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why refuse?" Ryan looked back toward the glittering city below. Because nobody should have to earn the right to simply exist. Valera studied him. That reasoning would be considered irrational here. Back on Earth, Ryan said, we usually call that a red flag. Another small flicker crossed her face. Not quite a smile, just surprise at hearing humor survive a moment like this. Thunder rumbled faintly through the clouds. Ryan crossed his arms. How long has this ritual been running? Valera turned away before answering. 411 years. Ryan stared at her. You're joking. I don't joke. Her tone hardened, colder and more formal. The rite of ascension was created after the Collapse Wars. The Empire nearly destroyed itself over succession conflicts. This ritual guarantees only one heir survives to rule. Ryan frowned deeply. So the Empire solved the political crisis by emotionally wrecking every royal family for 4 centuries straight. Valera lowered her eyes. Her silence answered more clearly than any words could have. Ryan exhaled slowly. Of course, every civilization found some elegant, official-sounding excuse for something monstrous. Humans were experts at that too. The only difference was whether anyone still felt guilty afterward. Nisara was never meant to rule, Valera said quietly, almost to herself. She hates conflict. Diplomacy interests her far more than conquest ever could. Ryan gave a small shrug. Sounds healthier than most politicians I've ever met. This time Valera actually smiled, barely, but real. The expression transformed her whole face for a fraction of a second before discipline buried it again. Ryan noticed anyway. You love her, he said gently. Valera looked genuinely offended. She's my sister. That wasn't an answer. The princess moved to the window instead of responding, and they stood together watching the glowing city beneath the storm. Air traffic drifting between towers, like slow-moving stars. When we were children, Valera said eventually, Nisara used to hide beneath the observatory deck during storms. She hated the sound. Ryan glanced at her. And you? Valera kept her eyes on the skyline. I would sit beside her until it ended. Ryan felt the full weight of that sentence settle over him instantly. Not for what she'd said, for everything she hadn't. The Empire had trained this woman into a weapon wrapped in royal silk, yet beneath all the ceremony and discipline she still remembered sitting beside a frightened little sister through every storm. Humanity, it seemed, wasn't exclusive to humans after all. The chamber door unlocked again with a sharp hiss. Both turned at once. Princess Nisara stepped inside, clutching a folded thermal blanket around her shoulders. Her golden eyes moved nervously between them before settling on Ryan. Then she said, the one sentence neither of them expected. The people outside are chanting your name. Ryan had survived orbital crashes, oxygen failures, and 3 evacuation riots during the Orion conflicts. Nothing had prepared him for hearing thousands of alien voices chanting his name beneath the palace walls. The sound carried faintly through the reinforced floor, low and steady, like distant thunder. Not angry, not violent. Something closer to hope. That unsettled him more than any riot could have. Nisara moved further inside, still clutching the blanket while droplets of rain glimmered in her dark silver hair. Unlike her sister, she carried none of that instinctive royal confidence. She moved carefully, almost apologetically, as though sorry for taking up space in the room at all. Ryan noticed that too. Valera straightened beside the window. Civilians shouldn't even be this close to the citadel right now, she said quietly. Nisara lowered her eyes. They've blocked every transit bridge. The lower units are refusing dispersal orders. Ryan blinked, caught off guard. Seriously? Nisara nodded softly. Most of the younger officers watched the ceremony broadcast. Ryan rubbed a tired hand across his face. Great. One stubborn human saying no in public, and apparently we've got a constitutional crisis. Outside, patrol ships drifted between skyscrapers through the rain, searchlights cutting pale ribbons through the dark clouds. The capital city of Varix Prime stretched endlessly below, layers of silver towers and floating traffic lanes glowing under the midnight sky. Beautiful, cold. Impossibly ordered, Ryan had seen cities like this before, during peace negotiations. The ones that looked flawless from orbit usually hid the deepest cracks underneath. The chamber lights dimmed as emergency systems kicked in somewhere deeper in the palace. A low mechanical hum rolled through the floor. Valera frowned toward the ceiling. The council is panicking, she murmured. Good, Ryan said. A little panic is healthy sometimes. Nisara studied him. You truly aren't afraid to speak this way to royalty. Ryan shrugged. Back home, politicians mostly survive because nobody tells them the truth to their face. To his surprise, Nisara smiled faintly beneath the blanket, small and fragile like a candle inside a storm. Ryan finally understood why the Empire considered her weak. She still allowed herself softness inside a civilization that worshipped control. Valera crossed the room and stood beside her sister, instinctively closer to the door, protective, without seeming to notice. Ryan pretended not to notice either. The council will demand the rite continue by sunrise, Valera said, and if the Emperor refuses, the noble houses across the outer systems may rise up. Ryan frowned. Over this, Valera met his eyes. You see 2 sisters. They see succession, stability, trade, authority, fleet command, resource control across 17 systems. Ryan exhaled slowly. That's the whole problem right there. Nisara tilted her head. What do you mean? Ryan looked between them. Every conversation in this empire sounds like it was written by accountants instead of people. A long silence followed. Not offended, thoughtful, rain crawled down the window while distant lightning lit the skyline. Somewhere below, another wave of chanting rose from the streets. Ryan couldn't make out the exact words, but he recognized the rhythm, crowds repeating a single phrase together. Nisara stepped closer. Do humans always challenge authority this directly? She asked softly. Ryan looked down at the glowing city. Not always, he admitted. Sometimes we get tired too. Sometimes we obey things we shouldn't. He paused. But eventually somebody asks whether the system still deserves protecting. Valera studied him. And if the answer is no, Ryan looked toward the crowds beyond the walls. Thousands of strangers in freezing rain because one human refused to play along. Then, decent people change it. Said simply. The room went quiet. No speeches, just rainfall and distant voices rising through the storm. Then the doors unlocked with a sharp hiss. 4 guards entered first, their armor dripping rainwater across the floor. Behind them walked Emperor Kaler Van himself. No ceremonial robes this time, no floating crown, just a plain black coat lined with faded silver insignia from another era. Without the trappings of power, he looked older, and somehow more dangerous. The guards withdrew silently as the Emperor entered alone. His crimson eyes settled first on his daughters, then on Ryan. "The council has reached its decision," Kaler said heavily. "At dawn, the rite continues." The words hung over the chamber, heavier than the storm still raging outside. "At dawn, the rite will continue." Ryan stared at the old Emperor, trying to decide whether he sounded cruel by nature or simply trapped by circumstance. Maybe both. The dim light reflected off Kaler's black coat, catching insignia, worn thin with age. Ryan recognized that look immediately. Veterans of every species eventually carried the same exhaustion in their eyes, the kind built from years of making impossible calls and convincing yourself, again and again, they were necessary. Nisara stepped forward first. "Father," she said quietly, "please." Kaler closed his eyes briefly. "The council fears instability." Valera's voice sharpened. "The council fears losing power." "Say what you mean." The Emperor didn't deny it. Outside, blue emergency light drifted across the skyline while crowds kept filling the streets below. Transport lanes stood completely blocked. Thousands of civilians stood shoulder to shoulder in the freezing storm. Waiting, watching, hoping someone inside the palace would finally choose differently. Kaler crossed the chamber slowly, boots echoing on the polished floor. "You believe this empire is cruel?" he asked, not quite looking at Ryan. "I think your empire is terrified," Ryan answered. The Emperor stopped mid-step. Silence stretched while rain tapped the glass. "Do you know what happened during the collapse wars?" Kaler asked at last. Ryan shook his head. The Emperor turned toward the city lights. 7 royal bloodlines destroyed entire systems fighting over succession. Colonies starved. Trade routes burned. Billions suffered because rulers placed personal attachment above order. His voice stayed level, though something colder moved beneath it. "Memory, mostly." "The rite ended that chaos," he said. Ryan folded his arms. "Did it? Really?" Kaler frowned. "Explain." Ryan gestured toward the streets. "Because from here, your people look pretty miserable for a civilization built on stability." Neither sister spoke, both watching their father carefully now. Kaler dismissed the guards outside the chamber. The door sealed with a heavy hiss. Suddenly the room felt smaller, more honest. The Emperor pulled a thin data crystal from his coat, holding it for several seconds without speaking. "There's something you deserve to know before dawn," he said finally. Valera stiffened. "Father." Kaler ignored the warning and slid the crystal into the console. A holographic display flickered to life, casting the room in pale blue light. Rows of ancient records scrolled silently through the air. Genetic contracts, succession treaties, agreements stretching back centuries. Ryan read the translated text, his expression slowly hardening. "Wait," he said. "This isn't just about naming an heir." Nisara lowered her eyes. Valera looked away. Kaler's voice turned painfully tired. "Whichever princess is chosen must produce royal heirs under council supervision. The bloodline stays politically controllable." Ryan stared at him. "You're talking about your own daughters, like government property." The Emperor's jaw tightened. "I'm explaining reality." "No," Ryan said sharply. "You're explaining ownership." The room fell silent. Even the rain seemed quieter. Nisara pulled the blanket tighter while Valera's hands curled into fists at her sides. Ryan finally understood the whole picture. The colors, the ritual, the spectacle, none of it was ever about tradition. It was control, dressed in ceremony. "So whichever sister survives," Ryan said slowly, "spends her whole life trapped in a political breeding contract." Kaler looked away first. That silence told Ryan everything. Valera spoke, her voice colder than the storm outside. "Now you understand why I wanted Nisara chosen." Nisara shook her head immediately. "No. I would never let that happen to you." Ryan looked between them and felt something heavy settle in his chest. Neither one feared death. Not really. They feared surviving outside these walls, trapped in something worse. The crowds kept chanting while the empire above struggled to grasp something painfully simple. A system could survive for centuries and still be wrong. The palace entered full lockdown an hour before dawn. Heavy blast doors sealed the upper levels, while warning lights pulsed along the endless corridors. Ryan walked beside both princesses under armed escort, though none of the guards looked comfortable with the job anymore. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others glanced at him with the uncertain look people wear when they no longer know who the enemy is supposed to be. Beyond the panoramic windows, the storm over Varric's Prime had finally begun to weaken. Rain still traced thin lines across the glass, but the first pale light was creeping in behind the skyline. The city below remained packed with people. Ryan could still see thousands gathered around the palace despite the bitter cold. No fires. No riots. Just people who refused to go home. Somehow that felt more powerful than any violence could have. The escort stopped outside a chamber, lined with dark blue alloy and glowing symbols. A guard opened the door. 1 hour before ceremonial transport, he announced stiffly, Ten Widre leaving the three of them alone for the first time since the arena. The chamber was quiet, except for the hum of climate systems. A curved window overlooked the eastern edge of the capital, the sky shifting slowly from black to deep violet. Ryan walked toward it automatically. Earth mornings never looked like this. Too many towers, too much silver, too little warmth. Behind him, Nisara folded the blanket and set it on a chair while Valera stood near the door, arms crossed. Still carrying herself like a soldier guarding a battlefield only she could see, Ryan rubbed both hands over his face. I still can't believe your empire thought this was normal. Valera answered without humor. When people grow up inside a system, they stop noticing the cage. Ryan glanced at her. That's a surprisingly wise thing to say. Don't sound so shocked. Human. Ryan, he corrected. Just Ryan. She paused. Ryan, she repeated. Hearing his name in her voice felt strangely different. Softer than before. Nisara moved to the window, her golden eyes catching the distant sunrise beginning to spread through the clouds. The crowd stayed out there all night, she said quietly. Many brought food and shelter for strangers standing beside them in the cold. Ryan glanced at her. Humans do that during protests too. Nisara looked curious. Even for people they've never met. Ryan gave a small nod. Especially then. Silence settled again. Comfortable this time, the kind built from shared exhaustion instead of fear. Valera eventually joined them at the window, pale light touching the silver in her hair. Ryan noticed something then. Without the arena, without colors and ceremony, they simply looked like two sisters standing together before sunrise. Not symbols, not assets, just people trying not to lose each other. The realization hurt more than he expected. There might still be a way to stop this, Nisara whispered suddenly. Valera turned sharply. No, please. Just listen. Nisara clasped her hands. If one of us renounces succession before the ceremony, the rite may legally end without a selection. Ryan frowned. That sounds too easy. Valera's expression darkened. Because it's incomplete. Nisara lowered her eyes. Whoever renounces loses everything permanently: name, citizenship, inheritance. Ryan stared at her. Your empire exiles people for stepping away from politics. Valera answered quietly. The council fears divided loyalty. Ryan laughed once. No real humor in it. Your council needs therapy. To his surprise, Nisara smiled faintly again. Small, fragile, real. But Valera didn't smile. She looked horrified. Absolutely not, she said firmly. You won't throw away your life for me. And you would? Nisara shot back, softer but just as sharp. Valera opened her mouth, then stopped, because they both already knew the truth. Of course she would. Ryan looked away, toward the brightening skyline. He remembered a line from an old commander, back during the Orion evac. Systems survive by convincing good people their suffering is necessary. At the time it sounded cynical. Now he understood it was simply accurate. A soft chime rang through the chamber. Ceremonial transport had arrived. Their hour was gone. Both sisters turned toward the sealed door together. Neither moved first. Then, almost too quietly to hear, Nisara asked the question that changed everything. Ryan, if this were Earth, What would your people actually do? The ceremonial transport dropped through pale morning clouds, like a silver blade cutting across the skyline. Ryan stood between both princesses inside the silent cabin, while the capital stretched endlessly beneath them. Dawn had finally broken over Varex Prime, washing the towers in cold violet light. The storm had passed, but the streets remained just as packed as before. Even from thousands of feet up, Ryan could see the crowds surrounding the arena district. Endless banners, makeshift shelters, citizens standing shoulder to shoulder in fading rainwater. The Empire hadn't gone back to sleep. Nobody spoke for several minutes. The only sound was the low hum of the engines and the soft hiss of climate systems. Ryan stared out the window, replaying Nisara's question in his head. If this were Earth, what would humans do? The honest answer was complicated. Humans fought wars over freedom while constantly inventing new ways to take it from each other. They built hospitals and prisons in the same cities. They were selfish and generous, cruel and compassionate, often all at once. But there was one thing humans consistently did better than almost any species Ryan had encountered. Eventually, somebody said, "Enough." The transport touched down on the arena platform with a deep hum. Outside, hundreds of guards stood in formation around the landing zone, their armor catching the glow of floodlights still burning through the morning haze. Beyond them rose the enormous Judgment Arena, even larger in daylight. Blackstone towers wrapped around a platform holding nearly 100,000 spectators, every seat filled today. Ryan could hear the crowd before the doors even opened. Not cheering. Waiting. The cabin doors slid apart with a hiss. Thousands of overlapping voices crashed over the chamber like ocean waves. Ryan stepped onto the platform beside the sisters as recording drones swung toward them from every direction. Massive holographic screens projected their images across the entire structure. Valera straightened, her composure sliding back into place like armor. Nisara inhaled shakily but kept walking. Ryan noticed their collars had finally been removed. That mattered more than he expected. At least they'd face this as people, not prisoners. Emperor Kaler Van Wate, at the center platform beneath the towering imperial crest. He wore full ceremonial robes again, though exhaustion still marked his face. Around him stood the full council, 12 nobles in silver and crimson, expressions caught between outrage and panic. Ryan recognized that look too. Powerful people always grew nervous when systems stopped behaving predictably. The arena quieted as the three of them approached. Overhead, weather shields shimmered as sunlight poured through the field. Ryan stopped before the Emperor. Thousands of drones focused instantly. Kaler raised one hand, and the arena went still. "The rite of ascension resumes," he announced. "The human representative shall now finalize succession before this council and the people of Varex Prime." An attendant approached with the silver staff again. Blue crystal, gold crystal, one sister or the other. Ryan looked down at the staff, then back at the sisters. Valera met his eyes first, calm and resolved. Nisara looked terrified now, though clearly not for herself. Ryan realized both women were quietly preparing to sacrifice everything for each other while the Empire watched like it was entertainment. Something inside him hardened completely. Not anger. Clarity. The attendant extended the staff. "Proceed," one council member ordered sharply. Ryan reached forward slowly. Tens of thousands leaned in, holding their breath. His fingers closed around the cold handle. The screens magnified every movement. Then Ryan turned, not toward the princesses, toward the council. Before anyone understood what he intended, he knelt slightly and set the staff at the Emperor's feet. The entire arena froze. Ryan looked directly at the old ruler. "If this empire genuinely needs someone to lose their freedom just to keep working," he said quietly, "then maybe the empire is the actual problem." For several long seconds, nobody in the arena moved. The staff lay against the floor between Ryan and the Emperor while tens of thousands stared down in complete silence. Even the broadcast drone seemed frozen mid-air. Then one council member stepped forward. Councillor Draven stood unusually tall, his armor layered with decades of political insignia. His face twisted with disbelief. "This is unacceptable," he snapped, his voice cutting sharply across the arena. "The human was never summoned here to question imperial law. Ryan turned toward him. Maybe somebody should have questioned it a long time ago. Another wave of murmurs rolled through the crowd, not hostile this time, uneasy, thoughtful. Dravin gestured toward the sisters. The right exists to preserve order, he declared. Without succession control, this empire risks total collapse. Ryan looked across the seats before answering. You keep saying order like it matters more than actual people. It does, Draven replied immediately. The answer landed harder than any shouting could have. Ryan noticed the reaction instantly, faces shifting. Citizens glancing at each other instead of the council, small fractures spreading through decades of learned obedience. Beside him, Nisara inhaled sharply, while Valera's eyes narrowed toward the council. Emperor Kaler Van stood motionless near the fallen staff, not yet touching it. Ryan noticed that immediately. The old ruler looked less like an emperor now, more like a man standing in the ruins of something he no longer believed in. Draven gestured toward the guards. Remove the human immediately. Several guards hesitated. Ryan watched it happen in real time. Small pauses, nervous glances. One younger officer near the eastern barricade lowered his weapon slightly instead of raising it. The council noticed too. Panic flickered across Draven's face. That is a direct order, he barked louder. Still, nobody moved. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Then something unexpected happened. A single voice rose from the upper tiers. Let them choose freedom. Another joined moments later. The right belongs to them. More voices followed almost immediately. Not screaming, not rioting. Just ordinary citizens finally speaking aloud. Ryan watched the sound spread like rain settling over still water. The right. The right. The right. The right. Thousands of voices now, steady and calm. Human protests always sounded chaotic. This sounded almost sacred. Valera stared upward in shock. They're siding against the council, she whispered. Nisara's eyes filled slowly with disbelief. No, Ryan said. They're siding with each other. Draven looked horrified now. Your Majesty, control this arena before it spreads beyond the capital. Emperor Kalaven bent down and lifted the staff from the floor. The arena fell silent again in an instant. Ryan realized he'd been holding his breath. Kaler stared at the two crystals for a long moment. Blue, gold, tradition, control. Centuries of fear dressed in the language of stability. Then, very slowly, the emperor turned toward his daughters instead of the crowd. Velara stood still while Nisara reached for her sister's hand. This time, Velara let her take it. Kaler watched them together beneath the morning light. When he finally spoke, his voice no longer sounded like a ruler's. It sounded like a father tired of sacrificing his children to history. For my entire life, he said heavily, I believed strength required obedience. The arena stayed quiet enough to hear the city humming beyond the walls. Kaler looked toward Ryan. But perhaps true weakness, he paused, is needing cruelty just to govern it all. Draven stepped forward. Your Majesty, you cannot possibly intend to enough. Kaler's voice cracked across the arena. Not rage, finality. The old emperor raised the staff high before the entire empire. Then, in one deliberate motion, he snapped it cleanly in half. The sound rolled through the arena like chains breaking apart. The broken halves struck the floor with a sharp echo that rolled across the arena like the end of an ancient prayer. For one suspended moment, nobody breathed. Then the sound began. Not shouting, not celebration, applause. Slow at first, uncertain. A single pair of hands somewhere in the northern tiers. Then, another. Then, hundreds. More. Within seconds, the whole arena thundered with it. Tens of thousands rose to their feet beneath the pale sky, the sound of their approval shaking the empire itself. Ryan stood frozen between the princesses as the impossible unfolded around them. The council looked horrified. Several nobles were already arguing among themselves, others simply staring as control slipped through their fingers. Emperor Kaler Van lowered the broken pieces slowly. For the first time since Ryan had met him, the old ruler looked lighter somehow. Still tired, still burdened, but no longer carrying the weight alone. Valera stepped toward her father. The movement was small, almost hesitant. Ryan realized she probably hadn't approached him simply as a daughter in years. Kaylor studied her as she stopped before him. "The rite is over," he sighed softly. Valera's composure finally broke. Not dramatically, just enough for the pain beneath it to show. "You should have ended this years ago," she whispered. Kaylor closed his eyes. "I know." Beside them, Nisara wiped away tears she no longer bothered hiding while the roar of the crowd rose around them. Ryan looked up at the towering rows of spectators. Thousands of faces stared back, not with fear or suspicion, something else. Recognition, maybe. As though the Empire had just discovered it was allowed to become something different, a palace officer hurried onto the platform carrying a glowing tablet. "Your Majesty, multiple governors are requesting emergency sessions. Demonstrations are spreading across the trade sectors." Kaylor gave a slow nod. "Good. Hey!" The officer blinked, startled. Ryan almost smiled. Nearby, several guards quietly removed their ceremonial helmets, one by one. Small, human gestures, the kind people make when they stop performing authority and start acting like themselves. Sunlight poured through the weather shield now, washing the arena in warm gold instead of cold silver. The storm had finally passed. Ryan exhaled slowly, like it was his first real breath in days. Then he felt something touch his sleeve. Nisara stood beside him, golden eyes reflecting the morning light. "You changed everything," she said quietly. Ryan shook his head. "No." He glanced toward the thousands of civilians still filling the arena. "They did." Valera turned to him next. The fierce warrior princess who once seemed carved from ice now looked exhausted and simply relieved to still have her sister beside her. "Most outsiders fear our empire," she admitted softly. "You challenged it instead." Ryan gave a tired shrug. "Humans have a bad habit of doing exactly that." To his surprise, Valera laughed quietly under her breath. Real laughter this time. Small, warm, human. The arena slowly began emptying as citizens flowed back into the bright streets of Varric's prime, carrying banners, conversations, and a future nobody fully understood yet. High above, the screens that once broadcast the rite of ascension now showed only the imperial crest, slowly dissolving into white light. Ryan walked to the edge of the platform and looked out over the endless skyline one last time. Air traffic drifted peacefully between the towers, while distant crowds kept gathering below. Not protesting anymore. Talking, thinking, hoping. Beside him stood two sisters who no longer had to fear becoming sacrifices for tradition. Behind him stood an emperor finally forced to rediscover the difference between order and compassion. And somewhere far beyond the clouds over Varric's prime, an entire galaxy was already beginning to hear the story of the human who refused to choose. Ryan rested his forearms against the cool stone railing as morning light spread slowly across the city beneath him. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he smiled. Because in a universe obsessed with power, one small act of mercy had finally made an entire empire fall silent.